This is a single kernel of wheat. It weighs approximately 35 milligrams. On the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, this kernel is worth a fraction of a cent, so small that pricing it individually would require scientific notation. But multiply this kernel by the 45 million metric tons of grain that pass through the Bosporus Strait every year, and you're looking at the caloric foundation for 800 million human beings. That strait is 31 kilometers long and, at its narrowest point, just 700 meters wide. It's the only water passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Every ship carrying Ukrainian wheat, Russian barley, or Kazakh corn to Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia must pass through this corridor. A corridor that runs directly through the center of Istanbul, controlled entirely by the Republic of Turkey. At 3:42 a.m. local time on January 22, 2026, Turkey's Maritime Authority issued Notice to Mariners 2026-0047, suspending all commercial vessel transits through the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits for a minimum of 72 hours, citing extraordinary security circumstances requiring immediate navigational restrictions. No further explanation was provided. No advance warning was given. 47 grain carriers are now anchored at the Strait's Black Sea entrance. Their cargo represents 2.1 million metric tons of grain, enough to feed Egypt for 6 weeks. This is not a shipping delay. This is a choke point activation. And when a nation that imports 60% of its grain suddenly cannot receive any, 6 weeks of missing supply becomes 6 weeks of political instability that no government survives. Here's what they're not telling you. The Bosporus closure is technically legal under the 1936 Montreux Convention, which grants Turkey sovereign authority over strait transit during times of war or imminent threat to Turkish security. Turkey has invoked this authority exactly twice since World War II, briefly during the 1994 tanker safety crisis and for 3 days during the 2016 coup attempt. Both closures were measured in hours, not days, and neither affected grain shipments. This closure is different. The 72-hour minimum window is unprecedented. The timing, late January, peak Southern Hemisphere import season, is catastrophic. And the justification, extraordinary security circumstances, references no specific threat, no military incident, no actionable intelligence that would explain why the world's most critical grain corridor must suddenly close. What happened at 3:42 a.m. was not announced. But satellite imagery from Planet Labs, captured by defense analysts, shows something that official channels have not confirmed. At 3:15 a.m., Turkish naval vessels took up positions at both strait entrances. At 3:28 a.m., 2 Russian Black Sea Fleet corvettes that had been transiting toward the Mediterranean reversed course and returned to Sevastopol. At 3:41 a.m., 1 minute before the closure notice was issued, a Turkish Air Force E-7T airborne early warning aircraft launched from Konya Air Base and began orbiting over the Sea of Marmara. This is the posture of a nation preparing to enforce a closure against resistance. The question is, resistance from whom? The answer requires understanding what Russia has been doing in the Black Sea for the past 90 days. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. Since the collapse of the Black Sea Grain Initiative in July 2023, Russia has maintained a de facto inspection regime over Ukrainian grain shipments. Russian naval vessels intercept carriers leaving Odessa, demand cargo manifests, and occasionally force ships to divert to Russian-controlled ports for verification. The practice is technically piracy under international maritime law. No nation has been willing to call it that because calling it piracy would require a response that no nation wants to provide. Turkey tolerated this arrangement because it maintained grain flow, even at reduced volumes. Approximately 65% of pre-war Ukrainian grain exports continued reaching global markets through the Bosporus, enough to prevent the acute shortages that would destabilize Turkey's own food supply and the supplies of regional trading partners. On January 19, 2026, that tolerance ended. Russian naval forces intercepted the MV Katerina S, a Maltese-flagged bulk carrier transporting 52,000 tons of Ukrainian corn to Alexandria, Egypt. Rather than conducting the usual inspection and release procedure, the Russian crew boarded the vessel, detained its officers, and announced that the cargo had been requisitioned for humanitarian purposes in Russian-administered territories. This was not inspection, this was seizure, and it occurred 12 nautical miles from Turkish territorial waters, close enough that Turkish radar tracked every moment of the incident. The Montreux Convention gives Turkey not just the right, but the obligation to maintain freedom of navigation through the straits during peacetime. Russia's seizure of a vessel transiting toward Turkish-controlled waters represents a direct challenge to that obligation. Turkey's choice was binary: accept that Russia now controls which ships pass through the Bosporus, or close the strait entirely and force a diplomatic confrontation. At 3:42 a.m. on January 22nd, President Erdogan chose confrontation. When institutions do this, they're not managing risk, they're containing disaster. Within 6 hours of the closure announcement, the World Food Programme convened an emergency session in Rome. No official statement was released, but sources present described the meeting as the most severe supply disruption scenario we've modeled since COVID logistics collapse. WFP pre-positioned food stocks in East Africa are calculated for 45 days of normal distribution. With Bosporus flows halted, those stocks become the only buffer between 23 million people and acute food insecurity. At 8 a.m. Geneva time, the International Grains Council revised its January shipping forecast. The original projection showed 4.2 million metric tons of Black Sea grain reaching export markets in the final week of January. The revised projection shows 0. The 4.2 million ton shortfall will not be replaced by alternative suppliers because alternative suppliers do not exist at this volume on this timeline. Wheat futures on the Chicago Board of Trade opened limit up, the maximum allowable daily price increase, within 30 seconds of the opening bell. The March contract jumped 7% before circuit breakers halted trading. When trading resumed, the contract rose another 4% before stabilizing at $9.47 per bushel, the highest price since the Russian invasion spike of 2022. Corn futures followed the same pattern. Soybean futures, despite minimal Black Sea exposure, rose 3% on contagion fears. The Bloomberg Agriculture Subindex recorded its largest single-session gain since the index was created in 1991. Less than 72 hours remain on Turkey's initial closure window. If the closure extends, and no diplomatic resolution is visible, the price spikes currently contained to futures markets will begin appearing in physical commodity markets within days. By February 1st, flour prices in Cairo, Tunis, and Khartoum will reflect the new reality. By February 15th, bread prices will follow. By March 1st, the political consequences will be irreversible. The 2011 Arab Spring was triggered in part by bread prices that rose 30% over 6 months. The Bosporus closure has created conditions for a 30% increase in 6 days. While one side calculates, the other side starves. Egypt imports 12 million metric tons of wheat annually, more than any other nation on earth. Approximately 80% of that wheat transits the Bosporus from Ukrainian and Russian ports. The Egyptian government subsidizes bread for 70 million citizens through a program that costs $5.4 billion per year, even at normal commodity prices. At crisis prices, that program becomes fiscally impossible. Egyptian foreign currency reserves currently stand at $35 billion, enough to cover approximately 8 months of total imports at current prices. But Egypt cannot spend all its reserves on wheat. It must also import fuel, medicine, and industrial inputs that keep the economy functioning. The realistic wheat reserve buffer is closer to $8 billion, enough to cover 3 months of crisis-priced imports before the government must choose between feeding its population and maintaining basic economic function. President Sisi has survived 2 price crises since taking power in 2014. Both times, he deployed military assets to distribute subsidized bread directly, bypassing the market mechanisms that would otherwise transmit price signals to consumers. This strategy works when the crisis is temporary and supply eventually normalizes. It does not work when supply disappears entirely. Tunisia's situation is worse. The country imports 65% of its grain, has foreign reserves covering 4 months of imports, and has already experienced 3 government collapses since 2011. A sustained grain shortage would not merely destabilize the government, it would dissolve whatever remains of institutional capacity to respond. Lebanon, already in economic collapse, imports 80% of its wheat through Beirut's port, the same port destroyed by the 2020 explosion and only partially rebuilt. The country has grain reserves measured in weeks, not months. Extended Bosporus closure would create famine conditions in a nation that still technically exists as a functioning state, only because international aid maintains the pretense. The humanitarian mathematics are simple and brutal. The Bosporus carries enough grain to feed 800 million people annually. Every day of closure removes 2.2 million tons from the global supply chain. At 7 days, the shortfall equals Ethiopia's total annual consumption. At 14 days, the shortfall equals Egypt's. At 30 days, the shortfall exceeds the entire global strategic grain reserve. This is not a shipping dispute. This is a caloric weapon aimed at populations that have no alternative food sources and no financial capacity to compete for whatever supplies remain available. The geopolitics of hunger have entered a new phase. Russia's strategic calculus in provoking Turkey is not irrational, it's asymmetric. Russia exports grain. Russia does not depend on Bosporus transit for food security. If the strait remains closed, Russian grain accumulates in Black Sea ports, prices rise globally, and Russia eventually sells its stockpile at premium prices to the same nations currently unable to access Ukrainian supply. The revenue lost from delayed exports is measured in billions. The leverage gained from controlling when those exports resume is measured in geopolitical influence that money cannot buy. China has positioned itself as the quiet beneficiary of grain market chaos. Chinese state trading companies purchased 8 million metric tons of wheat futures in November and December 2025, a volume that appeared excessive at the time, but now looks prescient. If the Bosporus remains closed through February, China's position will generate profits exceeding $2 billion, while giving Beijing physical grain supplies that can be redirected to allies or withheld from rivals. India, facing its own water crisis and declining agricultural productivity, banned wheat exports in May 2022 and has shown no indication of lifting that restriction. Australia's harvest is committed to Asian markets through long-term contracts that cannot be redirected. Argentina's crop won't be available until April. The nations that need grain cannot access it. The nations that have grain won't sell it. And the nation that controls the choke point, Turkey, has no incentive to reopen transit until its security demands are met by parties that have no intention of meeting them. This is what a system looks like when every participant defects from cooperation simultaneously. The mathematics of the trap are now inescapable. Turkey cannot reopen the Bosporus without security guarantees that Russia will not seize additional vessels. Russia cannot provide those guarantees without surrendering the leverage that vessel seizures create. Ukraine cannot abandon grain exports without losing its primary source of wartime foreign exchange. Egypt cannot survive without grain imports that the closure prevents. Every stakeholder has core interests that conflict with every other stakeholder's core interests. No compromise position exists that all parties can accept. The game-theoretic equilibrium is extended closure until one or more parties experiences state failure severe enough to change their calculus. The United States could theoretically break the impasse by providing naval escort for grain carriers, the same convoy system used in World War II to protect merchant shipping from submarine attack. But naval escort through the Bosporus would require Turkish permission that Erdogan has no reason to grant, and would risk direct confrontation with Russian forces that the Biden administration has spent 4 years avoiding. NATO's Article 5 commitment technically covers Turkish territorial waters, but Article 5 was designed for defensive scenarios where a member state faces attack, not offensive scenarios where a member state creates a crisis through its own policy choices. No NATO ally will invoke collective defense obligations to protect Turkey's right to close a strait. The UN Security Council cannot act because Russia holds veto power. The International Maritime Organization has no enforcement mechanism. The World Trade Organization's dispute resolution process takes years. Every institutional pathway to resolution is either blocked, irrelevant, or too slow to prevent the humanitarian consequences already in motion. 72 hours was the initial window. That window closes on January 25th at 3:42 a.m. Istanbul time. No diplomatic breakthrough is visible. No off-ramp has been offered. The machinery of global food distribution has stopped, and no one has the authority or capability to restart it. The informed are not waiting for official announcements to understand what's happening. Wheat ETFs recorded their largest single-day inflows since 2012, $1.4 billion in new positions betting on continued price escalation. Agricultural commodity traders are reporting unprecedented client demand for physical delivery contracts rather than cash-settled derivatives. The market for actual grain, atoms, not digits, is separating from the market for grain-flavored financial instruments. Gold prices spiked 2.3% on January 22nd, despite no direct connection to grain markets. The correlation reflects institutional recognition that food security crises become financial crises, become monetary crises. When bread becomes unaffordable, currencies collapse. When currencies collapse, gold becomes the settlement mechanism of last resort. The Egyptian pound has fallen 8% against the dollar since the closure announcement, the market pricing in the fiscal catastrophe that 3 months of crisis-level grain imports would create. The Turkish lira, paradoxically, has strengthened 3%, reflecting trader belief that Erdogan's gambit will succeed, and Turkey will emerge from the confrontation with enhanced regional leverage. Physical gold premiums in Istanbul have reached 6.2% over spot, the highest in the eastern Mediterranean, and a signal that Turkish citizens are preparing for outcomes that official statements don't acknowledge. Cairo gold dealers report panic buying, with premiums approaching 9%. The market for real assets is screaming what the diplomatic communiques won't say. This crisis may not end quickly, and paper wealth may not survive it. The question is not whether the Bosporus closure creates a global food emergency. The question is, who understands that emergency well enough to position for its consequences? 31 kilometers of water between two continents, 700 meters at the narrowest point, 47 ships waiting for permission that may not come, and 800 million people whose next meal depends on decisions being made in Ankara, Moscow, and Washington, by leaders who have every incentive to escalate and no mechanism to retreat. This is not a shipping lane. This is the jugular vein of global food security, and someone just put a hand around it. Physics doesn't negotiate, geography doesn't compromise, and reality, eventually, asserts itself over every system that assumes choke points will remain open because closing them is unthinkable. The divergence between diplomatic assurances and physical grain flows has begun. What happens next is not prediction. It's 700 meters of water that the world forgot could be closed.